Well, I'm Jo Fox, I'm Dean of the School of Advanced Study, and thank you all for attending today's discussion as part of the school's Peer Review Week. And it's clear from the engagement with the sessions so far this week that this is a really live issue. Well, today we'll be talking about the sustainability of our peer review system, often reliant on the goodwill of reviewers themselves under considerable pressures. Is the sheer volume of academic activity now part of the problem? What incentives are there to participate in peer review? And where does the burden of peer review fall? And equally, who is excluded from the peer review system? Is peer review enabling innovation, or is it simply maintaining the status quo? So today we'll be hearing perspectives from the research councils, from independent research organisations, IROs, from scholars, editors, from peer reviewers. And we have an experienced group to guide us through these thorny questions over the next hour and a quarter. And it's a great pleasure to welcome our panellists today. Tao Chang is Head of Infrastructure at the AHRC, responsible for developing the AHRC's programme for investment in arts and humanities research infrastructure. And she comes from a background in research facilitation and grants management in the museum sector. She joined the AHRC from the V&A, and in international partnerships. She was head of the international office at Cambridge from 2005 to 2010. Pip Willcox is Head of Research at the National Archives. The National Archives is an independent research organisation, an IRO, and carries out research across several fields, including applied computer science, archival theory and practice, conservation and heritage science, and research into the contents of the collections. Pip's own research is interdisciplinary, bringing together collections, technology, and people. Diamond Ashiagbor is Professor of Law at the Kent Law School, University of Kent. She's previously Professor and Director of Research at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies here at the school, so it's a great pleasure to welcome her back. She's an interdisciplinary legal scholar whose work spans labour, equality, regions, development, the economic sociology of law, and law and the humanities. And Diamond has been a recipient of a US-EU Fulbright Research Award, Ferdinand Brodel Senior Fellowship, and a Leverhulme Trust Research Fellowship. She's a member of the AHRC Advisory Board from 2019 to 2022, a member of the ESRC Grant Assessment Panel from 2014 to 2018. And she's been a member of the editorial boards of the London Review of International Law, European Law Open, Feminist Legal Studies, and Current Legal Problems. Charles Burdett is Professor of Italian and Director of the Institute for Modern Languages Research. And his principal areas of research are literary culture under fascism, travel writing, the Italian colonial presence in Africa and its legacy, theories of intercultural contact, and the representation of the Islamic world in contemporary Italy. He was principal investigator for the AHRC Beacon project, Transnationalizing Modern Languages, TML strand, Mobility, Identity and Translation in Modern Italian Cultures, 2014 to 2018, and the spin-off grants from that on global challenges and exhibitions for impact. He's a member of the HRC Peer Review College for a lengthy period of time, and while at the University of Bristol, he served for 4 years as Director of Research for the School of Modern Languages. So we have an absolute expert panel to talk about these issues with us today. The format for today is that our panellists each have 10 minutes to speak around the themes. We'll have a short panel discussion after that, and then we'll open up the chat. You're probably now very familiar with Zoom over the past months, but if I could ask you, you're all on mute and to remain so, and put any questions that you have in the chat. And it's best, I think, if you address them to all panelists and attendees. You can see that in the drop-down menu next to the two in the chat. And then we can see how others are sharing their thoughts and views, and hopefully questions will emerge from what we see in the chat. And I'll try to curate that among our panel today. So we'd now like to turn to the speakers, and Tao, I'm going to turn to you first of all. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jo, and thank you very much for inviting me. Jane, you're invisible, but I know you're there. So I thought, because I can see that in terms of panel, I think I am the least of everybody here. So I'm going to start from this really, really boring AHRC policy administrative perspective of just looking at the peer review college. We have, at the last count, 970 peer reviewers, and they are split across 6 colleges: academic, strategic, ODA, HEI, non-HEI, knowledge transfer, and international. And the peer review college is currently drawn from universities, HEIs, and that rather catch-all phrase, well, actually, no, I'm just going from IROs, from independent research organizations, which means that at the moment, the membership comprises individuals from organizations which UKRI can directly fund, or AHRC can fund directly. As you all know, the purpose of the peer review college is, as far as possible, to ensure that the quality of grants that are funded is absolutely top level and is excellent. And also, it's AHRC's sort of periscope, as it were, into what is happening in the research community. It enables us to keep up to date, or rely on our peer review colleges as a means of telling us, informing us directly or indirectly what are, what the burning issues in our research communities currently are, what the cutting edge methodologies and approaches are. And by extension, it sort of encapsulates or tries to embody what the Haldane principles for research are, which are also sort of embedded in the Higher Education Act. I think we all know, in terms of challenges and problems, it's not perfect. And I think AHRC has come under certain pressures. I'm a fairly new team. My team is fairly new. I was set up in 2019. And even though, every single team is different and there's no typical team, I would say that in my 18 months or so in post at AHRC, it's become very, very clear that there is a growing expectation from UKRI Central that we are more interdisciplinary and we reach across different sectors and we can demonstrate impact beyond research communities and beyond our normal sort of communities or sort of constituents where we produce impact. And when you sort of look at the peer review college, where the constituents are from HEIs or IROs, there is a gap. So from the point of view of whether or not it's sustainable, from my point of view, we need more, not less. We need more people, not fewer people, and we need to diversify the base. This became, I can give you a case study. It became particularly apparent when AHRC ran its very first major capital investments call last September. It was called Capability for Collections, and its purpose was it was 2 streams of funding. One was investment into refurbishment of facilities, particularly for heritage science, for digitization, for reading rooms, for storage facilities and access facilities for collections. And the second stream was for replacement of kit, of machinery, of scanners, of SEMs, of scanning electron microscopes and things like that. And it became very clear that looking at the peer review college, we sort of went, oh, who on earth do we invite? Who on earth do we invite from our peer reviewers of academics from HEIs and researchers from IROs to actually provide a clear steer on which organizations should receive funding for a capital grant? And we brought together a panel. One person in that panel of 12 was from the peer review college. Everyone else was not. The chair was from the Institute for Conservation, ICON, and most other, what we also found was that most other peer reviewers were not even from the AHRC community. In order to reflect the breadth of disciplines in the applications, we had to bring in physical scientists, we had to bring in beamline scientists from Diamond Light Source. And what sort of became very clear at that point was our peer review college, sort of membership as it stands at the moment, isn't really up to dealing with major infrastructure calls, because they are capital projects. They're not research projects as such. They're building projects. You've got construction, you've got, so we need PIs who understand how to manage workflows in a construction project, know how to procure equipment, in some cases pretty expensive equipment, and all the sort of tendering and procurement processes that come with that. And therefore, in some cases, the principal investigators weren't even academics. They didn't hold academic contracts. And if there's going to be, what the question that sort of popped up in my head at the time was, if we're going to continue in this vein, if AHRC is truly going to build a pipeline for infrastructure, what's our peer review component for that going to look like? So that's one case study, and I'll finish soon. The other case study is around interdisciplinary areas which are not always properly represented. Now, if you look at the 970 peer reviewers, 39 are from IROs. That's 4%. Do the maths. It's not great. What does that actually mean in practice? And this hits upon the question of whether or not we are perpetuating a particular status quo, or we are actually enabling new ways of working and new forms of research. And I would say that 4% isn't a particularly impressive statistic for non-HEI peer reviewers. And I would sort of ask my fellow panelists, also you, if you were in my position of having to make sure that different types of research from different parts of the research community, including from libraries, from museums and collections organizations, if that is truly to be evaluated and judged and assessed on its own terms and not within an academic university-led framework, what does the peer review panel need to look like? So I think I'm gonna stop there. And I know it's more questions than not, but I think these are interesting areas of discussion. And as ever, I would very much value the community to lead the way to solving the problem.
Thank you, Tao. And that provides a perfect segue into you, Pip, from an IRO. And maybe you'd like to think about the kind of questions that Tao's just posed there too.
Thanks, Jo. Yes, and thanks, Tao. A lot of what you've spoken to feeds into notes that I've made. But thank you, Jane and Gemma, as well for the invitation. I'm particularly grateful to be able to bring a perspective from an independent research organisation. Clearly, I'm not speaking on behalf of all the IROs, but I have canvassed opinion across the National Archives, so I'll do my best to represent it. So UKRI says in their principles of assessment and decision making that they are in line with our values of collaboration, innovation, integrity and excellence, and contribute to supporting a world-leading research and innovation culture across the UK. So we have a system designed to promote integrity and excellence. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that colleagues across UKRI and other funding organisations as well do a fantastic job administering a really complex system. And it's lovely to have UKRI represented here through Tao. Hello, Tao. And having worked myself in both universities and the more directed research environment of an independent research organisation, I think peer review works well within the constraints that we operate in, though the systems perhaps is creaking a little, as we are all acknowledging. It works well in protecting the Haldane principle of research independence and in letting researchers set the agenda. And it seems to work equally well for directed calls as well as for open and responsive ones. my feeling is it may be less good at promoting research that shifts paradigms. So it naturally tends to favour incremental advances in knowledge, sort of recognisable and familiar to reviewers perhaps. And for similar reasons, as Tao was just mentioning, the interdisciplinary research can often get quite short shrift from reviewers. It's something I'll come back to in a moment. So I've collated themes that emerged when I consulted colleagues about their experiences of peer reviews, both as reviewers and as funding applicants. And there was a feeling that it can be hard to identify enough appropriate reviewers, and this exactly speaks to what Tao was just saying. So believing this, colleagues find it very hard to turn down requests to review, particularly as by the nature of the work, it falls into areas they care deeply about and they want to bring a practitioner's lens to it. I was taken by the language that one of my colleagues used, sort of in an apology for having been quite robust, which I was very grateful for. Obviously, they said, I have thoughts on this, having had a ton of peer review land on me this month. And the language speaks volumes, I think. So I'm not the first to note that calls seem to arrive regularly with quite short lead times. And knowing this also, I think, encourages reviewers to feel more pressure to take on those reviews and to return them promptly. That's no small task to fit in a proper review, taken seriously, into overbusy lives. Now, having just participated in both the review and panel stage of a large call, I see some of the practical difficulties that can arise. Reviewers accept invitations but don't deliver, or which means that more reviewers have to be invited at even shorter notice. Some reviewers don't respond to an invitation at all but send reviews anyway. And hats off to the brilliant people at UKRI who navigated through all this, and at scale. It was a large call, so there's no shade on them. But not suppressing any reviews, not wasting any work, meant that principal investigators had up to 6 reviewers to respond to in a short space, and panelists also needed to reflect all those many views and voices when assessing them. Some colleagues felt that removing impact statements and the technical appendix has reduced their ability to review some critical elements in proposals. I report this because it came from more than one person, but I don't entirely agree myself. I think encouraging applicants to weave the impact of research throughout a project seems an improvement to me. But I take their point that disbanding the technical reviewers and bringing data management plans into the main body of the proposal may leave some reviewers out of their depth in some areas. So these thoughts, it seems to me, may be common across reviewers. Before I turn to our particular perspective, I thought it might be helpful for people who don't know about independent research organisations to say just a couple of words on them. So I'm quoting from the IRO, Independent Research Organisation Consortium's website. We are an organisation, we are organisations which are deemed by AHRC to have a large enough research critical mass to be considered for AHRC funding in the same way as a university. So there are IROs in all sorts of areas of research, NHS trusts, for example, the Observatory, Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, World Conservation Monitoring Centre, but the IRO Consortium, IROC as we call it, that falls more within AHRC's remit, and we work closely as part of that consortium. We are largely museums, galleries, libraries, one archive, that's us, and other heritage organisations. We lead or collaborate in funded research in support of the wider aims of our organisations. So for us at the National Archives, it's in support of our public task as set out in the Public Records Act, and as the national lead for archives through our corporate vision, Archives for Everyone. And so on to our perspective. There is a strong feeling that projects led by IROs are less well understood by reviewers in general. And Tao mentioned what a small proportion of the peer review college comes from IROs, and that may be related, and that they have a lower success rate. So our own experience at TNA makes for, the National Archives, makes for too small a data set to be statistically significant. But I would be interested to see UKRI-wide data on this. I think it might be a perception more than reality, but is there special pleading to be made for IROs that particular effort should be made to find reviewers knowledgeable enough and sympathetic to that form of research? I'm not convinced, and I don't want to make that case. To me, it seems that any research that crosses traditional boundaries, interdisciplinary research of all kinds, for example, or infrastructure, as Tao was just saying, or research that turns received knowledge on its head, it might suffer a similar fate. So is there a need for more information to be shared with reviewers about what work IROs undertake as part of their core function, where and why they might request additional funding for particular work? Some reviewers appear unfamiliar with research taking place outside higher education institutions altogether. And this may feed into a broader point about reviewers tackling areas that are not core to their own expertise. Where reviewers lack confidence in their opinions, it can be hard to respond to them fairly. Equally, misplaced confidence in their own ability to review all aspects of a project can lead reviewers to score clearly but harshly. And a similar difficulty arises when the relevant kind of expert opinion is not sought. One colleague pointed to an unidentified, I should say, project that had already been funded when it crossed their path, and which in their view was neither viable nor legal in the practical approach the project was intending to take to the research questions. So I move with some trepidation onto some provocations of where we might go, how we might improve. And I'm aware that there are larger discussions that today will feed into around peer reviewing for publication, for example. I don't think I'm bringing anything new to this, but I would note that a growing range of humanities projects have significant technical components. Archives is one of these. And I'm taking technical in its very broad sense, so beyond simply digital, to include interoperability standards, legal compliance, infrastructure, and so on. Is there an argument to be made for including expert bodies in this process rather than simply peers? Colleagues at TNA are happy to be part of the peer review college, and could we look more widely for reviewers drawing in greater comment from outside academia in general? Would payment help with managing workloads? Academics and academic related careers so precarious, there might well be benefits to this more inclusive approach. I should note that I'm asking for a friend. Civil servants can't be paid for work they undertake as part of their roles. I appreciate this might or could be thought to lead to a dip in quality as people who need the money for understandable reasons take on reviewing to stay afloat. But we might balance this against the bonuses of increasing reviewing participation from, for example, early career researchers, and that the system would benefit from fresh perspectives and knowledge, and that the reviewers themselves could benefit from the insights and the new knowledge that reviewers are privileged to gain. Should we seek an end to anonymity? We could give credit for reviewing and link it to career advancement. Accountability might, how should I say this, might also encourage better mannered reviews. So a modest proposal, circling back to where I began, which is to acknowledge that peer review is us. We are the peers. It may be time for radical change. I'm looking forward to today's discussions, but it's always time for incremental improvements. If the system is us, we can affect the change. So may I suggest modestly that we review with love and generosity and compassion and humility, as well as with selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership, those that I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Nolan principles of public life. I've been privileged enough to read a fair few reviewers' comments through participating in review panels and from my work in research across the National Archives. I might raise an eyebrow at the selflessness and objectivity of a very small number of reviewers. I imagine I'm not alone in having seen reviews whose subtext reads, "I'm both clever and well read, and your research doesn't take account of the methods I favour," or "you don't appear to have cited me." But objectivity in assessing research is famously hard, and most research into peer review that I've read suggests that objectivity has not been achieved and may be unachievable. So I let that lie, with a request perhaps that we double check our prejudices when assessing work, particularly where either we are particularly drawn to it or set against it. On generosity and compassion, please might we all remember that there's a person at the other end who's put considerable time and thought and effort into this application in front of us. If this were a person you were mentoring, how would you frame your comments? How would we help that person improve rather than tear them down? And on humility, the greatest minds I've met have been the readiest to welcome challenge and the chance to revisit their views or findings. It's okay to be expert in part of an application and know little about the rest of it. And as research increasingly embraces interdisciplinarity, this is likely to increase itself. Might we choose to speak to what we know and do our best not to let our final score reflect any lack of knowledge or understanding? Something like this might give applicants something to focus on in their response. Clear explanation of the technical aspects of this project and linking them to the overarching research questions would be helpful. And on love, few of us are in research for the money or the fame. Telling hard truths as we see them can be the most generous of acts when we put thought into how we articulate them. Rigor and excellence come first, but they can be served up constructively and with pointers to improvement. So my thanks again to you for giving me your time, and to the organisers of today's event for giving me the opportunity to share our perspective, and to my colleagues who, as always, were generous in sharing their experience with me.
Thank you, Pip. Thanks for that thoughtful intervention. Diamond?
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much to Jane Winters, Claire Lees and Joe Fox for organising this whole week. When Jane asked me to take part, I was really happy to say yes. I think it's so important to have this discussion to demystify peer review, which I know has been going on during the earlier part of this week, but then also to have this policy discussion. And in particular, I'm thinking about early career researchers, sort of demystifying the process, in particular early career researchers. So I was really struck by something that Tao said and something that Pip said. So Tao asked the question at the end, what does the peer review panel need to look like? And Pip said, maybe now's the time for radical change. So what I'm going to end up on the second half of my talk is going to be about the composition, the identity, the location and the origins of peer reviewers. I'm going to talk a little bit about the AHRC Peer Review College, but I'm going to start by talking more generally about peer review, because obviously this week it's been, our theme for this panel is peer review under pressure. And clearly we've had a chance to discuss this week peer review for journals, for grant applications, for promotions, for other aspects of academia, such as the Research Excellence Framework, the REF. So I'm thinking I'm going to be focusing more on peer review in the context of grant applications, but some of what I say hopefully applies more broadly. So just to say something about how I come to peer review, and that governs my take on it and on the question of whether it is under pressure. And I want to end by engaging with the questions that Pip and Tao asked. So one of the bits of experience I've had, which very much guides my thinking, is spending 4 years on the Economic and Social Research Council, the AHRC Grants Assessment Panel, 2014 to 2018, where our job was to assess applications for research grants between £250,000 and £1 million. And there were 4 panels, total of 40 panel members. I was on what's called Panel B, which I was a socio-legal scholar, so I was the only legal scholar on a panel comprising people from sociolinguistics, sociology, social policy. You can get the drift. And then since 2019, I've been a member of the advisory board of the AHRC, and the role of the advisory board is advising on strategies and programs to support and fund research and to articulate the value of arts and humanities research to a wide range of audiences, but also to give guidance on future scoping. So in that context, so this is again sort of my particular engagement with peer review, and to turn to this issue of identity. Who are the peer reviewers? Okay, just to give you a little vignette from last July, August. As a member of the AHRC advisory board, one of the things we do is we're sometimes asked to, for instance, advise on a review which is conducted by a private research organisation into 8 years of the AHRC funded doctoral training partnerships. So I was involved in that. Another thing I was involved in, so this is a vignette from last summer, I was asked if I would do some grant assessment, be on the panel for the Where Next ? Scoping the Future of Arts and Humanities led research. Okay, so that was the panel I agreed to be on, and it was a new call for interdisciplinary scoping studies which would explore and develop ideas for kind of bigger, so pilot studies, ideas for interdisciplinary research areas which could form the basis of future research initiatives, you know, the grand sort of strategic areas, priority areas, you know, not quite as big as the one Tao mentioned in terms of capital investment, but the sort of thematic priorities, okay. 2 weeks after I said yes to that, I was asked by a member of the ESRC office if I would be a member of the panel. There was what they call highlight notice, quite a quick, rapid turnaround call, rapid response call following the outbreak of COVID. The urgency of this highlight call, closing in a few weeks, was to undertake agile and proportionate assessment to decide on funding for research on impact of COVID-19 on minority ethnic groups. A week later, I was asked by another colleague in the ESRC, currently commissioning the second phase of a programme called Governance After Brexit. And that was quite an advanced stage of commissioning, but an existing panel member in my rough discipline had unexpectedly had to withdraw. So they asked me if I could replace that panel member as a panel member and as an introducer. So introducer is the term used. So the ESRC panel I was on for 4 years we would basically I'd be allocated something like between 3 and 10 grant applications 3 times a year. And what I would see would be the case for support. In the old days, it would be the impact case study, data management plan, 3 or 4 peer reviews. I would read and assess, and then the other introducer, blind, would also read and assess. We'd come to the meeting if we both scored above 7 or 8, and we would deliberate and the panel would make a decision recommendation. So I was being asked by the ESRC twice to be a panel member and introducer. So the reason I mentioned this sort of autobiographical vignette from last summer was one of the things I'm now doing in the HRC advisory board is, and this is coming back to Tao's point about what does the PRC panel need to look like. We're having a wide-ranging conversations about diversity generally, about who is being funded. And part of that involves discussing who is a member of the peer review college. I would also say that those discussions need to be broader about not so much who is being funded, but also what are they being funded to do, and diversity including thinking about not just the range of backgrounds in terms of gender and race, but also in terms of career stage, institutional home, and what we might call knowledge production. So what this vignette suggests to me is the need for a shake-up of people who are asked to undertake peer review and hence develop expertise in it and then keep on being asked to do it. I don't think there's anything special about me. It's just a few years back, I applied to join the ESRC Grants Assessment Panel, and my only experience peer review, well, my experience peer review up until that point had been being an editorial board of a couple of journals, being on university promotions committees, and so peer review in the broader sense, being involved in running my department's ref. So it's a kind of peer review in its broadest sense rather than grant review. And what that very much leads me to think is the word diversity is used, institutions often use it as a proxy for a lot of different aspirations. And often it's because the word equality, which is the legal term, is considered a little bit scary. So organizations tend to prefer, if they can domesticate, translate it into their own language, a term like equality, which might seem to have certain kinds of connotations. So you want to sort of domesticate it into a term like diversity, which may or may not be seen to be less threatening or scary. But often it's forward-looking, which is good, but it doesn't always, diversity doesn't always enable an institution to think, okay, the reason we look the way we do now, the reason this peer review college looks the way it does now, is that 5 or 10 years ago, these were the people who we asked or who stumbled into this, or who, oh, look, these are the people who have the expertise and the experience. And so they're going to be from certain kinds of institutions, possibly. I mean, obviously it's 970 people, so this is, it's quite a broad college. They might have certain disciplinary specificity within a discipline. And they might also have a certain set of approaches to how one engages in what we might call knowledge production. What types of topics are taken seriously as subjects for study? So what that sort of leads me to think is the work that we're doing now in terms of diversifying peer review colleges, whether it's incremental or radical, is only really going to bear fruit in a few years' time, unless we do something a bit more radical, as Pip suggested, which is, I think, to fast track. So this is why I was referring to early career researchers at the beginning. I obviously don't know who's an attendee, but I would very much encourage people to get involved. I know it's very, very difficult to know how much to say yes or no to and not to overburden yourself, especially the year we've all been having. But things like, for example, doctoral supervision, most institutions that I've worked in will typically assume and hope to have a better practice would be a doctoral supervision team of 2 or 3. And I think there's an awful lot of benefit in having people who are new to supervising as part of a team, because what you learn is the value of being a supervisor isn't just because you are on all fours with the topic of your supervisee, is that you're learning how to guide somebody so that their ideas can flourish. And I would say the same about peer review. So I do think there's something to be said for encouraging, nurturing, bringing on board people who haven't had 10 years of experience undertaking peer review, because if this process, this revamp process, is to do what we wanted to do, we need to use those principles. Tao and Pip mentioned the Haldane principles as almost guidelines for training. And so I could go into a lot of detail about, for instance, when one reads peer reviews as an introducer, I've learned so much from how to give good peer reviews, which is meaningful, and as Pip said, not about your ego, but also generous in recognizing that this is tentative, but I think there's enough evidence there for us to have faith in something which is still experimental. So actually, training for peer reviewers is what I'm going to end up finishing on, is possibly a way we can short circuit what might otherwise take quite a long time to build a pipeline, so that if we're talking about, for example, the peer review college in the context of the AHRC, the panel, we don't have to wait for 5 or 10 years for it to look differently. Just want to finish on one final anecdote, and it's about one of the jobs I had when I was working at ECL was overseeing the PhD program. And when I left to go to SAS, one research student, he was applying to do a postdoc at ECL, came and asked me about, you know, how she might present her research. And I said, tell me what her research was. And it's something I don't do at all. It's corporate governance. It's what happens when companies go bust, and should you pay the creditors, should you pay the employees? And I asked her to tell me what it was. And she went and studied she's from Nigeria, did a master's and PhD in the UK. She went during her PhD, did research in the US, in New York, and in Lagos, in Nigeria, and obviously in London, in the UK. And I said, I don't know anything about corporate rescue, but what it seems to me, your project is about regulatory design. It's about asking a question about how a legal solution to a social economic problem. It's not about Nigeria, although it is, but it's much about the UK and the US as it is about Nigeria. So my final point about peer review and training peer reviewers is to recognize, and this is a really difficult shift, that what is in our discipline or subdiscipline seen as generalizable, capable of creating broad theory, which is then given specific instantiation, we might want to think about shaking that up, rather than theory is formed by these people here or by that part of the discipline and it's applied elsewhere. So this for me is a particularly interesting for me in terms of knowledge production in the global north and global south. But I do think that I think is an element for me about what I think about when I think about diversity in peer review, and what does peer review college look like, not just in the long term, but perhaps, you know, in the next few years, thinking about diversity in all these different formats. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Diamond. There's a lot there for us to pick up on, I think, in discussion. I'm going to turn finally to Charles.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to begin by saying one or two things. The importance of peer review is clear at so many levels and in so many forms, from funding schemes, grants, fellowships, journals, book projects, the ref, promotions. And it's the mechanism, as people have said, through which the Academy ensures quality and through which it regulates itself. I think, again, as people have said very powerfully, that it's the system that makes us aware of essentially how dialogic or relational the work is that we do. Dialogic, in a sense, it's indeed even in a formal way in which the PI often has the chance to respond to comments and scores, but dialogic also in the way in which disciplinary fields are by their nature mobile and in a constant process of transformation, And that transformation, of course, needs to be done in a structured conversation, of which peer review is absolutely essential. So it suggests new pathways, it affirms a sense of community in the broadest sense, and it's all about the awareness of new ideas, new agendas, new ways of looking at things, which can be radical to incremental. But again, as people have said, it carries with it quite significant burdens. Above all, I think it's necessary not to assume that a researcher is necessarily aware of the implications of peer review. It requires a certain awareness of critical debates, agendas, where they are, and how they are located societally. It requires an ability to see things in context and self-criticism, a distrustfulness of a partisan point of view. It requires the assessment of impact necessitates understanding in the broadest way of the articulation with of the academy with society, and certainly with the educational sector as a whole. And peer review can be quite conservative. When in some respects, especially a sort of relatively large grant, its purpose is to move things on. And peer review can be a little bit skeptical of that. Also, writing peer review, I mean, when one's trying to assess peer review, I think one needs a clear, direct statement, but one also needs that statement to be properly verified. Both if it's very positive or very negative. I mean, that process of verification, not necessarily written in a particularly literary form, but nevertheless clearly articulated and argued. It's also, as far as the AHRC is concerned, fundamentally important to match comments with scores. It's often the case that, or certainly in my experience, I've been looking at grant proposals who've received extremely positive comments and yet scores that don't quite match that. And absolutely, I would subscribe to the points that have been made about the ability to write direct but constructive criticism, or criticism which certainly one is prepared to be de-anonymized. Also, the size of the pool. It's absolutely clear that there are very significant and highly varied demands on academic time. It's extremely important that the pool represents a diversity of positionalities and viewpoints. It needs to engage with junior and senior academics. There needs to be an awareness of ethical implications of research. Interdisciplinarity poses problems of its own. So the pool, though it may seem large in some respects, can be actually quite small, as has been pointed out. And it can be even smaller by the fact that in many respects, academics are impelled to be quite ruthless about the demands on their time. And it also, above all, requires a very high level of conscientiousness. So what I'd like to do is to suggest, just quite briefly, one or two ways in which one can address or questions around addressing these potential and real problems. One is that given the centrality of peer review to everything that one does, is it perhaps right to ask the question whether recognition for the labor and commitment that goes into peer review is sufficiently recognized? I'm not sure that it is recognized in promotion processes, or indeed, as my fellow panelists have said, the way in which it is filtered through into a general consciousness of the working of academic structures. For example, I think we should perhaps get away with the idea of good citizenship. I mean, that sort of is a rather, at best, its meaning is very unclear. And perhaps we should be recognizing more that peer review can perhaps be quantified. It can be perhaps stated what appropriate level of peer review is at different levels of career stages. so that formal mechanisms are in place to make sure that people are not victims of their own enthusiasm, commitment, or indeed altruism, and in fact, that their understanding of the relational nature of their work is properly recognized, rather than, in fact, being overly ruthless in dedicating one's time to one's own particular projects. The second point is, again, has been noted, greater understanding of how important peer review is. It leads to events of this time, training on peer review, absolutely, possibly even position statements that make it clear that this needs to be filtered into the way in which we think about everything that we do. I also have my final point, and I say this as someone who's been involved in subject association, both in my own subdiscipline Italian studies and more broadly now, of course, within the School of Advanced Study. And one of the things I think I would suggest is it's not enough to assume that the system will look after itself, which can be a view of a subject association, that in some way people do put their names forward and that's okay. I think, generally speaking, a laissez-faire attitude, which is not necessarily the norm, but which can be quite common, is not really enough for a subject association. I think there are situations in which there aren't enough qualified reviewers to assess a proposal, and a proposal is, let's face it, only as good as its peer reviewers. Without peer review, there isn't a chance of funding. So I wonder whether there might be ways in which subject associations see it as very much their business to ensure that their processes for ensuring equality and diversity feed into their thinking about peer review, the representation on subject panels, that there is a greater sense of the turnover of peer reviewers, in the sense that one group will phase into another and so forth, that it is properly supported by the subject community, that there is an appropriate changeover between senior and more junior staff, and that engagement with peer review is appropriately staged. And above all, that peer review plays an important part in fostering a professional identity. Going back to the point with which I began about all that we do within the academy being dialogic and relational, and the very positive advantages and extremely important sense that peer review feeds into one's own scholarship is something that feeds into a notion of a developing professional identity and consciousness. And I will stop there.
Thanks very much, Charles. Well, that really does lay out some of the key questions for us across our four panelists. Now, I just wanted to kick us off by asking about change, because all of you have spoke about change in different ways, whether it's from the incremental through to the radical. And I'd like to start on the radical end. How far do you think we're ready for radical change in our peer review system? Certainly there are changes we've all suggested today that need to take place, but how radical are we prepared to go, and are we ready? Does someone want to kick us off? Diamond, do you want to give that a go?
Okay. So I realise, I mean, just thinking about what Charles was saying there about peer review as part of professional identity formation and how you become inculcated into the discipline. I'm actually going to think about radical change in trying to answer the question from Adriana Junta, where she's saying she's finishing her PhD, just completed, and interested in becoming a peer reviewer. Is it too early to start now? What's the process? Start working in becoming a peer reviewer? And the thing is, of course, it's not as it's not typically the case that one can apply to become a peer reviewer. When one thinks about peer-reviewed journals, it's very much if you are on the radar of the editors. So it's something which is occurs through a process of becoming more established in one's discipline or subdiscipline, being asked. There are some aspects of peer review where one can put oneself forward, such as apply to join the peer review college, and every now and then peer review colleges seek additional members, and there is a sort of criteria, frequently asked questions and so on. And I suppose that kind of question makes me think whether we involved in a body such as the AHRC, one way of being more radical is to be more proactive in seeking out peer reviewers from different communities. So Tao was talking about even a peer review college of 970, there was not sufficient expertise to provide a steer on capital grants. So this might only seem radical if you're used to kind of the quite staid current structure of peer review. One sometimes what happens with grants, at least, is one goes straight to the grants assessment stage, cuts out the peer review stage. So the members of the panel are also doing the peer review as they go along. I'm wondering whether that might actually entrench it as an activity which is understood to be only capable of being done by people who are very, very experienced. And I suppose I'm just thinking, how is it that we can bring in people who by definition don't have that expertise already, because the pipeline hasn't been very effective? So perhaps there needs to be a way of restructuring peer review colleges to actively invite people who are, what they're bringing is the fact that they are early career and the fact that they might have a different approach to scholarship because they're relatively new and still discovering themselves as scholars.
Thanks, Diamond. I think that feeds sort of nicely in. Tao, do you think that the radical change will come as being driven by need? You've described a very different, changing set of requirements and needs, the kinds of projects that now are coming up for review, and then opening up that question as to who is going to become a peer reviewer in this circumstances. Will that process in itself start to drive that kind of radical change that we've been speaking about today?
I think inevitably it will, because AHRC is also working, and you're talking about peer review being under pressure, AHRC is also working under pressure. UKRI is quite a young organisation, but it already, I wouldn't go so far as to say the centre is imposing its will, but it's certainly introducing new ways of working, which are much more fast-paced, with much tighter turnaround. There are a sort of portfolio of hypothecated funds which are from the centre, and the way that works within the organisation is that UKRI comes up with a pot of money after establishes a new fund, and the research councils are then asked to bid for a piece of it. Now, on the one hand, you think, okay, well, this encourages different research councils and other constituent parts of UKRI to become competitive and to focus. But on the other hand, there is a question of whether that actually then enables or encourages interdisciplinarity. There's no time. Usually the turnaround is 6 weeks. You then sort of get to, with the capital grant, I had a week to put together a proposal to the centre. A week later, I was told it had gone to panel. And a week after that, I was told I had a notional allocation. And it was the result of a fiscal event within government for 300 million for capital investment. But there was a string attached to that particular call, which was whoever you give it to needs to finish their project by the 31st of March. And between running a call and finishing, that left slightly under 4 months. So inevitably there will be pressures on AHRC to adapt to this particular pace. Whether it's sustainable, I think that's, the jury's still out on that, but there will be pressures. And I think, you know, there's been a radical change in organisational culture within UKRI, and it is incumbent upon research councils such as AHRC to adapt.
We've got a question from our audience here about whether we feel that it's radical or incremental to de-anonymize peer reviewers, and Pip, you mentioned, you know, some of the changes around the actual process of feedback and the kinds of feedback you get. Do you think that that would be an important change to make in the system?
It seems to me it would be an excellent change to make. And I think in terms of, there are already experiments going on. You can put up preprints in many fields. That's very common, and you have a sort of peer review process in the open. There are other journals that are set up that are already peer reviewing, not anonymously. I don't know what the word is for that. Peer reviewing in the open with named reviewers. I think what might be a much more radical change and much harder to affect, certainly it's beyond any individual's remit or power, is the change in attitude it would need. Because I absolutely take Diamond's point, I think is excellently made, that that we ought to be taking active steps to diversify in all senses, in every sense, the peer review college. But if you're a very established person in your field, you're very used to receiving research funding, and some person that you have never heard of, they've barely been in, you know, in academia or in research 5 minutes, and they think they can tell me what to do. That attitude, which I think is rare. I hope it's rare, but I think some people might carry more weight. If you see the great name in your field applying for funding, are you able to bring that objectivity to it, knowing that you'll be held accountable publicly for saying, actually, I don't think that much of this idea. You know, this person's had excellent ideas in the past. Clearly, they've changed the nature of research in my field, but maybe, you know, this is not actually one of their better ideas. So I think that the radical change would have to come from within us, and that internalizing that humility and ability to accept feedback, which is not easy. So I think, yeah, the radical change is not necessarily in the system for that, I would suggest.
Thanks, Pip. Diamond, do you want to come back in on that, about what are the drivers for that kind of culture change that we're talking about here?
I don't know. I mean, it's. I don't know. Those people who are on Twitter would have seen a kind of running meme about the meanness of reviewer 2, almost as a sort of joke. Obviously, it's always a second reviewer in terms of journal articles, and it's almost a sort of a joke how bad peer review, bad in the sense of not that it's constructively critical, but bad in the sense that it's not. It's asking the person to write an article they weren't planning to write, and so on. I'm not quite sure where that culture change comes from. And perhaps it does vary by discipline. I do know that some of the journals I've been involved in, and especially this past year, you might have an automated system, but a human being can go in and change the text of the automated letter to the peer reviewer and try to find a way of practicing kind of radical kindness with regard to peer reviewer and expecting that from them in their work that they're doing. But yes, that kind of cultural change, I don't quite know how we institutionalize it.
Do you want to come in on those questions before we move on?
Sorry, I mean, did you ask me, Joe? Yeah, sorry. Yes, no. I think, yeah, these are extremely difficult, vexed questions. I mean, and I think, I agree entirely with what people have said. I mean, I think the need for joined up thinking, the way in which research councils work, as I was saying, with subject associations is one example, but also, of course, with the way in which they articulate with individual universities, disciplines, discipline centres and so forth, is something that requires, as others have said, a great deal of proactive thought. It's also, I think, in some respects, a greater sense of the way in which the situation is changing extremely rapidly, and whether set ways of doing things are able to account for the rapidly changing environment is one question. I think possibly within a sense of an individual academic at whatever stage, a willingness to engage in transformative work and to see transformation as part of the process rather than falling back on a series of received ideas is perhaps an area where work can be done. And I think in terms of a greater formalization of the whole process is extremely important, because otherwise I think you are dependent upon a series, often on goodwill, often on things being taken for a given, and in some ways, yes, people at a certain stage, as Diamond was saying, inviting more junior colleagues, when perhaps there should be a greater sense or greater discussion of the way in which some of these processes are formalized so that they promote greater engagement and absolutely greater equality.
Thanks, Charles. We're getting a few comments now around sort of the speed and the scale now required of peer review, and whether the sort of pressures on the system will require some kind of radical rethink, whether it's from book reviews coming out a long time after now the book is originally published, or indeed, picking up on Tao's point around the speed of these UKRI calls and a fast response needed from peer reviewers. Tao, do you think that, following the suggestion in the chat, that to do that well, to be able to respond to that, means rethinking the process of peer review as well as the expectations of the funding councils around peer reviews and panel responses?
Absolutely. I think, I have to say that the peer review, AHRC's peer review college was set up, or it works best with standard responsive mode funding, where where you have where the timeline is about 9 months to a year, or sometimes if you're lucky 6 months, the point that you hit submit on JES through to when you get your grant letter. In that sort of time frame, it is possible for my colleagues in the operations team to go through the peer review college to identify appropriate reviewers, and then from there to set up panels. But it's a process that is, it's a 10 or 11 step process. I saw it, I had to look at it, the spreadsheet for it. You can't squish that into 3 weeks. It's really, really difficult. It poses all sorts of challenges, and in its current state, it posed for AHRC, and I'll be candid here because I know I'm among friends, about whether or not we would be able to pull together an appropriate. We did go straight to assessment panel, and we used the sort of introducer format, but there was, until we brought the panel together and written up the guidelines, there was real concern within my team and within AHRC's leadership about whether or not it would be the right panel, whether they would be able to come to award grants appropriately, whether or not the integrity of the system was somehow at stake because we pulled it together in such a hurry. And it also, with fast turnarounds, it also places enormous sort of strain on people who want to apply for grants. Obviously, I mean, that's not a question that we're addressing in this particular session, but how do you pull together a multi-partner, multidisciplinary, well-considered, truly groundbreaking sort of knowledge-creating grant proposal in 3 weeks or 6 weeks flat, as the case may be? It's really, really, really hard. So I think there are lots of things that we do need to think about, and I suspect the solution will be a mixture of radical and quick fix, and then a much more longer term sort of slow burn that's what I think will come from it. But it is something that we're thinking about very carefully in AHRC.
Thanks, Tao. I'm going to just turn the conversation over the other way now, because a lot of the comments that have been made today, and also we've got some comments in the chat, centre on issues of reward and recognition. And Charles, I know you touched on this, Pip, Diamond, you know, whether that's a financial reward and moving away from this sense of you know, goodwill. But also there's a question in the chat around, you know, how do we recognise that in career reward systems, particularly when we're looking at drawing on peer reviewers from a number of sectors where the promotions criteria are going to be different. Is it time for a peer reviewer charter or concordat, something that establishes a set of principles, or is this another layer of bureaucracy that we don't need? Is there another way through? Charles, can I start with you on that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, just looking at some of the comments in the chat, I mean, for example, a book review is appearing 5 years after a book. I mean, that's not ideal, but there at least is a review. I think there is a wider danger in people finding that they don't have time to write book reviews, or indeed it's difficult to write book reviews. It finds its way very much to the bottom of the pile, because not that one doesn't believe that this is a very important part of what we should be doing. It's just that there are so many demands on people's time, and that there isn't quite the same incentive to engage with that kind of scholarship that there is with other elements of our work which are more formally recognized. So I do very genuinely think that it is time for a concordat or a document of some kind that really does stress the centrality of peer review, and perhaps takes away some of the givens that exist around it, and the fact that suggest, or indeed really try to move the sector into the formal and staged recognition of the business, because without it, I think what we do, all of what we do, is potentially compromised.
Diamond?
Yes, we've mostly been talking about those bodies such as the AHRC, which are the recipients of peer review. And I obviously I can't really speak about what independent research organisations should do, but thinking about universities, higher education institutions, they do get the benefit. Obviously, they get the benefit of peer review because you know, academics' work is peer reviewed, and in order to be awarded grants and so on. But I do think that there is we're perhaps letting universities off the hook a little, because they're not sufficiently. It's part of the thing that I'm conscious of. Okay, people who benefit from peer review but aren't necessarily contributing to supporting it well enough. One group would be commercial publishers, and the other group would be universities. Commercial publishers, obviously, because whenever we talk about open access, and so whenever I go to a panel on open access, and in that, as I am listening to people talking to me about green open access and gold open access platinum, I think, oh yes, no, I've got it now, I understand it. And then 10 minutes later, it's gone. And that's because open access is so mainly defined by what a publisher determines is accessible, but because actually the university library has paid a subscription. And I think the same with peer review. All this invisible or unpaid labour by editors, by peer reviewers, obviously by authors, is certainly not being given reward and recognition by publishers, but it can be given reward and recognition by universities. And so when we see how, certainly I'm sure it's true for many places, promotions and probation processes are becoming increasingly prescriptive. So ref is used as a proxy for research, for instance. It seems to me that the sort of things that people are encouraged and expected to do in a sort of invisible way on top of everything else, especially things they might do outside of their home university, it's perhaps universities are beholden to give more recognition to the disciplining building work. So citizenship, other than helping to run a master's program in your universities, but citizenship for the discipline, for the learned society. And this is where peer review comes in. And so every now and then, journal editors and people involved in sort of wanting to publish in journals talk about, should we pay peer reviewers? Should we pay editors? I don't know, but what I do think is that universities can certainly do more in the processes of reward and recognition, probation, promotion, eligibility to apply for research leave if such a thing exists. Peer review can be factored in, and if it takes something like a Concordat, what I say about something like Concordat, and I know it seems like more bureaucracy, but what I find really interesting when I go from being on the HRC advisory board to coming back to your university committee is universities are slightly having to feel obligated, rightly, to take seriously AHRC, ESRC criteria about things like demand management. No university wants to be left out in the cold and told the kinds of grants you're sending our way are not going to be funded. So I think the EKRI actually has more power than it perhaps thinks it does in terms of steering, moulding, pushing, cajoling universities to do things.
Yeah, and to have that built in, that then being a strong steer to have that kind of reward recognition built into the system. Pip, how would this work for IROs? Because that's another dimension of this.
So as I mentioned in passing, the payment model wouldn't have anything to do. We don't receive money for things that either we do during work time or that we do using skills and knowledge that we've built up during work time. So that wouldn't, because we're already paid. Sorry, don't feel sorry for us. That particular question wouldn't affect at least IROs that are civil servants. It might be different in other sectors. I mentioned it crosses all over. I'm not an expert, couldn't speak to that. Well, the research might look very similar that's done at a university. If you took, just a random project from a university and a research organisation, independent research organisation, the quality of the research might look very similar. As I mentioned before, they tend to, in IROs, they tend to speak to larger corporate sort of strategic aims and directions. And those, but it's not in the quality or the type of research necessarily, but it's in the career structures. Because if you're following a research route, obviously you can of course follow a teaching route and others, I'm sure, within academia. But if you're following a research route, essentially you publish and you bring in research funding, or at least you do research, and in some fields that involves research funding. But in an IRO, your ability to publish and the excellent research that you might do doesn't necessarily lead to promotion, because promotion tends to mean taking on more management, and as in many technical areas. So for example, research software engineers have similar discussions at the moment. It's hard to get career advancement through becoming more expert in your technical field. So for example, in certain records, and that. So one of the many reasons to do peer review is to learn more about how applications are put together, to get a greater understanding of a wider range of subjects in your own field, in order very, very approximately to, amongst other things, to increase your chances of career progression. And that doesn't really map across in the same way to IROs. I very much like the idea of a Concordat, and I think, Diamond, you used the word invisible, and I think that's the difficulty, that it becomes, we all work with people who say, oh, could you just, and it's like, no, really not. And if we're thinking about equality and about becoming more inclusive as a peer review college writ large, who are we excluding? And amongst the people are people who are on precarious contracts, people who are not well enough paid, so need to get other work, but also anyone with caring responsibilities. If you're responsible, for example, for older people in your family, or for example for children, or many other examples, you can't drop everything to write the fantastic groundbreaking application that Tao mentioned in 3 weeks flat, by the time you've given your research office 3 weeks to work through their side of it. And I think that's a great loss. So having a Concordat that sets out, this is a worthy thing and time needs to be given in your day job. This is not a could you just, this is actual work. I think that would be welcomed.
Thanks, Pip. And certainly there's a lot of comments that should be fed into here in the discussion in the chat around, if you do have a Concordat, really taking account some of the positions of early career researchers where part-time, whether dependent on part-time work, giving people less opportunity to offer their time for peer review and actually needing that payment for support. And here we've got journal editors talking about, it's harder to track down the contact with someone who's written a great paper in the area you want a reviewer, and harder to find the early career reviewers too. So some of that needs to be fed through. So that, I think that's a good point on which to draw today's discussion to a conclusion. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today who've offered their experience and insights, and I think it really illuminated this subject for us. We've touched various times today on interdisciplinarity, and if you wish to pick up on that question, just to highlight that at 4 o'clock today, there's another session in Peer Review Week looking at peer review and disciplinary change, chaired by Claire Lease. But in the meantime, I do hope you join that session, but all that remains for me to do is thank you all for coming today. It's been great to have such lively discussion in the chat, and thanks especially to our organisers and our panellists for their time today. Thank you so much, and I wish you all an enjoyable evening.